Prior to going through today's readings, I had not known what an exogenous shock was, and I do agree that COVID is a really great example of what this means to see a shock arising from outside a system. So, after going through the articles we read today, it was really interesting to see different markets and how they were affected. Common themes I noticed between these articles was just the lack of unpreparedness going into an unprecedented event. The infrastructures of these markets were not at all built to handle such a change in such a harsh time during this pandemic. So going specifically down into talking about the grocery stores, it was really interesting to see how in more recent times grocers had implemented a more lean stream process, meaning that there was less transfer, there was less lag. What this looked like is that grocery stores did not have as much distribution centers. It was direct from the manufacturer to the grocer, as opposed to historically going from the manufacturer to their warehouse, to the other warehouse, and so on. So this was something that worked really well during normal times, but where this became a really big problem was that by having less inventory on hold, it created a much longer backlog that was way harder to bounce back from for grocery stores. So I know personally for myself, going back to that time, I remember seeing shelves that were bare. I remember specifically toilet paper was the hot topic of COVID. And I remember there became a time where toilet paper would hit the shelves and it was gone within hours. And even so, when there became a little bit more consistency in the stock of toilet paper, there was a limit on how many customers were allowed to take. So that was just a really interesting thing to see implemented and understand, and it makes sense as to why this approach occurred the way that it did with the infrastructure. So also going into the food market, it was interesting to read about the strawberries. There was a lot of inconsistency in the demand for strawberries, as it said historically. In a couple months going into COVID, there was less demand, so they'd planted less going into that year. So there already was a substantial log going into COVID. But I found the quote from the article specifically really interesting that says, "Those acres won't yield berries until next spring. The world will change 3 times over between now and then." This quote specifically is so true, as there was a lot of demand for we need strawberries now, but the lack of knowledge that strawberries will not come for several months, as these are items that need to be planted, and that's not a process that's necessarily rushed. I know when the demand was implemented from the article, it did say that there was so many excess vegetables and fruits that were discarded, some of which were plowed over, and then others were thrown into ditches. Coming from a food shortage angle, that's a really interesting thing to think about, as there's so much global food shortage. So that was kind of something that was a little unsettling and just really surprised me about that whole period. Thirdly, looking into airfare. Airfare is something that is really interesting to talk about, as I remember how drastically low airfare was during that time. There has been such a change in the airfare model in general, as the at-home remote working model has been implemented for a lot of businesses, not only nationally, but internationally. So I'd be curious to kind of have a better scope and understanding of what's going on in that market currently and what's driving those prices. But there was also a lot of change during COVID specifically for leisure travel, as travelers were not able to go on vacation, as that was not necessary travel. So that was just something really interesting and kind of surprising to learn about. But another interesting and shock that I read through the articles was looking at the banking article. It makes sense that models really are not built for that much volatility. There's only so much an equation can really handle when thinking about a harsh, unprecedented time such as COVID. So I'm sure that volatility was really, really hard to adapt to. And also to the question of how long do we need to shoot out for? What's the bounce back period of not only our banking market, but other markets? So having a really comprehensive scope of what that looked like from a rounded sense. I thought it was really surprising that they kind of moved to looking at new information such as traffic or phone data. That was a really clever implementation from banks, and I would like to learn more about how that was implemented, because I thought that was really interesting. Key ideas I took away from the readings is the importance of having an adaptable market. Although the entire point of the exogenous shock is that they are shocks that arise from outside a system and might not be prepared for, I think the pandemic was a really great example of something such as that occurring on a global scale during a current time. To my knowledge, there wasn't something of that capacity for during modern periods. So I think having documented and having an understanding of the way that occurred during the modern era, and how things could be implemented if this were to occur again during current times, that's super important in having a market that is able to kind of fluctuate. I don't think it's really reasonable to have backlog. I think implementing lean processes as grocers had done prior to the pandemic is something that's really good for current times. But I think just having an idea of how to fall back to being adaptable and conservative if needed is something that's really good to have in mind. And secondly, during these periods, something I'm taking away is the importance of having diverse thinking in decision-making settings. Going to the strawberry example, it's so interesting kind of seeing that demand from business owners and markets being like, we need the strawberries now, but farmers and people in agriculture are saying, that's not practical, we're having way too much over, under, whatever the case may be, and really having that diverse thought process, having a better understanding of all markets involved in the moving part that you're looking at is a really great tool to have during such adverse and uncertain times. But overall, I found these articles to be really interesting. It was kind of a great pullback to the past of something I hadn't thought about in a long time, which is surprising, being it really wasn't that long ago. But I'm grateful that we have moved past COVID in a lot of senses. And yeah, I'm curious to see what other information is released.